Hello and welcome. The spectre of austerity is haunting Europe, but could there actually be a silver lining in that gloomy economic future? For many in the modern world, the job we do has come to define who we are, but what does this largely Western mantra mean for the generations of youth faced with the prospect of many years of mass unemployment? Around Europe, countries are embarking on multi-year deficit reduction packages and biting into bitter austerity pills. But as people brace for public spending cuts, joblessness and falling living standards, there are those who believe that the downturn may actually force us to re-evaluate what might be some unrealistic expectations that have been rising for generations. Today we ask, how might the effects of those financial crisis issues make us question Western definitions of success, and what other ways are there to measure our value? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. You can send an SMS or an email, and we also welcome your phone calls onto the show. Joining me now from London to discuss these is the Swiss-born philosopher Alain de Botton, renowned for making the high-minded world of ideas relevant to people's daily lives. Among his many books he's written, The Pleasures and Sorrows of Work, where he explores the joys and perils of the modern workplace, and Status Anxiety, which explores the Western world's obsession for professional achievement and questions accepted definitions of success and failure. Alain de Botton, honoured to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me on.
I want to kick off with the question, are we basically being pressured too much, or perhaps pressuring ourselves too much to succeed?
Look, the modern Western capitalist vision of success is both incredibly exciting and incredibly punishing. We tend to believe nowadays that you are your job, and your performance in the highly competitive workplace defines who you are as a human being. It's not a coincidence that when people meet each other for the first time, they ask each other that central modern question, which is not who are your family, where do you come from, but that sole central question, what do you do? And according to how you answer that question, people are either incredibly pleased to see you or look at their watch nervously and move on. You are your job, and that makes it both exciting and deeply perilous.
How do you define success then? What values or parameters would you put on it?
Look, I think my view of success is that success is a word that each of us has to find a way towards, a kind of definition that works for you. When we hear the word success, we immediately imagine someone who's made money and perhaps achieved fame. That's the modern definition of success. But you know, if you look up success in any dictionary, success is just doing something well. It doesn't say what it is. So being a success just means achieving something that you've decided to do. And the problem with the modern world is that it thrusts images of success which don't necessarily suit everybody. And also it's important to say that no one is a success in every area of their life. You know, show me a success in business and probably you're likely to be somebody who's not achieving so much in other areas of their life, and vice versa. So that word success is very value laden and definitely worth probing and sometimes developing a new view on.
Now, I know it's a big question. Perhaps I'm asking for a compressed version of compressed answer to it. But what has brought us to where we are? What has led society in general, certainly Western society, to define success the way we've been discussing it right now?
Look, essentially for the last 200 or so years, there's been an ideology of materialism, material success. In previous ages, both in Europe and the United States, the dominant vision of a human being was a religious one. In other words, you are a good person if your soul is pure. Nowadays, this is not, despite people paying lip service to organized religion in Europe and the United States, essentially what counts is your performance in the marketplace. And that's been happening, as I say, for certainly in the UK and other parts for 200 years and more. And it's something that has released enormous energy. You know, if you think of the productive capacities that are being driven by this psychological need that people have to prove themselves, it's awe-inspiring. Look at the factories, look at the logistics systems. What's really underlying all that energy is people who want to be liked, loved, respected, esteemed for their performance in the workplace. That's what keeps the engine going. And it's a wonderful system and also a very cruel system. This is the system that breeds one of the highest rates of suicide in the modern world, to be found in the wealthy countries of Europe. These are the places where there's an individualistic philosophy that reigns. You are not your family, you're not who you know, you're not who your friends are, you are what you have done. And that is both empowering and troubling.
So if we look at the situation right now where the austerity measures that are coming into place across much of Europe and other parts of the world, people are having to look at their financial positions, they're having to, I guess, some degree redefine themselves. Do you believe they're reevaluating that concept of success as a result?
I think so. I think one of the things that's really changing is the vision of luck. You know, until recently, until the financial crisis, one can say that the idea of luck was in decline. In other words, people felt that what happens to them is not the basis of good luck or bad luck. It comes down to their own efforts. That was the reigning Western philosophy. And, you know, the idea is you make your own luck. It's very hard to say that you completely make your own luck against an economic backdrop which drags everybody down, which slows everybody down. You know, there used to be entrenched a very deep meritocratic philosophy. That was the reigning philosophy on left and right in all developed countries. Now, what is the meritocratic philosophy? A meritocratic philosophy says that the best country is one in which everyone who deserves to get to the top, who merits to get to the top, can get to the top, and those who deserve to get to the bottom deserve to get to the bottom. That's what politicians always speak about. You know, let's create a fairer society, which doesn't mean everybody gets paid the same amount. It means everybody has the same chance at the beginning of life. And of course, the United States has that philosophy in spades. Now, the thing is, it's harder to believe in a meritocratic philosophy when you have a few financial institutions that are dragging the whole economy down, the greed of a few individuals undermining the efforts of millions. It becomes harder to believe in a meritocracy. And in a way, talked about a silver lining earlier, it becomes slightly easier to live with yourself. Because if you have to believe that everything you do is your fault or your credit, that's very tough, very punishing. But if you can say, hey, I swim in deeper currents, there are other things going on that control how well or badly I do, that takes some of the pressure off the individual.
Let me quote your book, your excellent book, Status Anxiety, in which you talk about meritocracy. And just to take a little piece of it, it says, the ability to accumulate wealth is prized as proof of the presence of at least 4 cardinal values: creativity, courage, intelligence, and stamina. The presence and absence of other virtues, humility and godliness, for example, rarely detains attention. Do you believe that, I mean, you talk almost as if the two are mutually exclusive, as if we swing between the two and there's almost no middle ground. Is it that we fail to reach that middle ground?
Look, when we evaluate what a good person is nowadays, a good person primarily, and I'm simplifying, but I do believe that essentially this is right, a good person is someone who's good at business. You know, that is essentially our ideal of the modern human being. 300 years ago, the ideal of a human being was to be military. That was the military Western ideal. You're strong, you're cunning in war, you're brave, you're courageous. That's what it meant to be a good human being. If you scroll even further back in history, there have been periods when to be a follower of Christ was very important in many Christian countries. Nowadays, success in business. And like any of these ideals of what it is to be good, it leaves many people thinking, well, actually, I don't subscribe to that. You know, I'm not a, just as 200 years ago, there were people who were not good soldiers. They didn't know how to fight. They weren't interested in fighting. And they were saying, no, you know, try and evaluate me as a full human being, even though I can't do that. So too nowadays, in the rather depressed countries of Europe at the moment, there are people saying, okay, I'm not a success in business, but maybe there are other sides of me that are worth considering. And, you know, there have always been voices that have been saying, let's stop squashing people into these caricatures. Let's stop having these very narrow definitions of success, which leave most of us feeling, you know, we can't measure up to them. So I think that's often been the thrust of people who've stood outside the dominant economic system.
We had an email that came in from Paris in France, and I want to read that to you. Justine Lamboli wrote in saying, are we headed towards a redefinition of values after the main economic systems, capitalism and communism, failed to provide happiness and self-fulfillment? Now, the revaluation we touched on to some degree, or redefinition perhaps, but is it that capitalism and communism failed us completely, or just the way we applied them?
Look, I think we've been living in an interesting period from about the fall of the Berlin Wall to the fall of Lehman Brothers. There was a feeling that the essential argument about how to run societies had been resolved. You run a society as an economic liberal entity. You know, capitalism reigned triumphant without fundamental questions about values and goals. Now what's happened with the financial crisis and also the environmental crisis, questions that used to be asked only by bearded Marxists with sandals in the universities of Europe have now become mainstream questions. Questions like, what are our economic goals? Should growth be the only criteria by which an economy measures itself? Is there a way of measuring well-being that isn't simply economic? These have now become questions on all sides of the political spectrum, and it's fascinating to see that, as it were, the questions of the left have now become questions of everyone in the wake of the financial crisis.
I have a phone call on the line. We have a phone on the line. Sorry, if you're on the line on the phone, Paul in California is with us. Paul, go ahead.
Hey, how's it going? I just wanted to ask him, do you ever thought we're going to get rid of our addiction to money as regards to success? And I wanted to thank you, because I've learned a lot from watching your program over the last year.
That's very kind of you, Paul. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Very insightful.
All right. Thank you. And Alan, I'll pass over to you.
Yeah, well, a big question. Can we do away with money? Look, money, for all its problems and its inaccuracies, and we all know ways in which money cannot measure value in certain areas. You know, works of art. How are you really valuing a work of art? You know, does money really capture the value? No. Take things like parenting. Anyone who knows a bit about parenting knows that parenting doesn't make you any money. Is it valuable? Of course it's so valuable, but we have no economic way of measuring it. So money fails to capture lots of things. But I think economists at the cutting edge of their field are now learning to build more complex models. I mean, one of the most basic things we've learned in the last decade is when you're measuring things with money, don't just measure profit this year. If a company is making a big profit but has at the same time destroyed a piece of the environment, that is a cost that society is bearing. So that is not pure profit. That is profit minus some environmental damage. We're learning to be a little bit more subtle, a little bit more complex. I think we're going to be better at pricing things. And one way of looking at the current upheaval in the world is to say we're repricing a lot of things that we thought were cheap are actually more expensive, and vice versa.
Interesting, because an email that I'd like to put to you touches on this to some degree. It's from a viewer by the name of Levi James, who wrote in saying, we can measure our values based on whether they have positive or negative impacts on ourselves, others, and the environment. But is it as simple as that?
Look, I think it's up to all of us as societies to mould our values. And one of the things that the current upheavals in the Middle East show is that societies seem to be very static for a long time. It looks like nothing is moving. Everything is, frozen in the permafrost, and that can often seem that way with values. So we think it's normal to value certain people, to have our education system geared the way it is, to have our politicians pointing at certain things, and then suddenly a confluence of factors can occur, and enormous revolutions in value systems occur. Take the position of women. That's been around for 100 years now in the West. The position of women has been transformed. That's been essentially a value change. And there are other examples of this as well. So values can be molded, and it's the job of philosophers, thinkers, talk show hosts, television stations, that we're all in the business of subtly, day by day, through words, changing values. And in that sense, we all have it in our power to affect the way we live.
Alan, another quote from your book, Status Anxiety, where you talk about the whole issue of status anxiety. And you say, life seems to be a process of replacing one anxiety with another and substituting one desire for another, which is not to say that we should never strive to overcome any of our anxieties or fulfill any of our desires, but rather to suggest that we should perhaps build into our strivings an awareness of the way our goals promise us a respite and a resolution that they cannot, by definition, deliver. So how do we set realistic definitions then?
Well, look, I think there's one really important concept to introduce, and that's the idea of perfection. So long as a society is in its bones religious, it will never believe that life on this earth can be perfect. When society is basically secular, however many people go to the temple, the church, the mosque, if it's essentially secular in its bones, it will believe that society, through sufficient technological breakthroughs, political tinkering, and other forms of psychoanalysis and therapy and other things, society can be made perfect. And I think that many modern Western societies have a belief, an implicit belief, that things can be made completely perfect. More religious societies think, no, that's not possible. That's why we have an idea of paradise. That's when things can be perfect. On this earth, things are always going to be flawed, because human beings, well, they're just human. And I think a lot of our anxieties in the modern world stems from a belief that we should have the perfect job and the perfect marriage, the perfect relationship, living in a perfect world. And it's a beautiful ideal. It energizes us. It causes us not to accept the second best, but it also drives us slightly crazy. A society that tells people you can do anything is going to have a problem with what Americans call low self-esteem. That constant drive for perfection creates a kind of restlessness and an anxiety that I think we need to monitor in ourselves and in our societies. By all means, let's be ambitious, but also let's realize the difference between a healthy ambition and an almost maniacal desire for perfection.
Now, in reading research on you and actually listening to some of your lectures online, I heard how you said tragic art could help us. Give our viewers an example of how tragic art might be a useful tool.
Well, look, tragic art, it emerged from the theatres of ancient Greece in the 3rd century BC. We think of the word tragedy. We talk about tragedies all the time, but a tragedy was really originally, in its ancient Greek sense, a piece of theatre that described how a life can suddenly be messed up, suddenly be ruined. A king, high and mighty person, makes a mistake, sleeps with the wrong person, gives money to the wrong person, is blind for a minute, and suddenly their whole world collapses and they are ruined. And I think many people have argued that in the modern world what we lack is a tragic awareness of life. The Greeks, the ancient Greeks, had that tragic awareness. They knew that life is short, that life is very vulnerable, and that at all times accidents may occur to us. And they believed that to think a lot about this isn't a recipe for getting depressed. It's a recipe for, in a way, appreciating every moment much more and for being sympathetic to other human beings, to realize that other people that you meet at all circumstances are all the time wrestling with deep tensions. So to see life as a tragic business that we try and navigate as best we can, but will never be completely free of some pretty big problems, death being the main one that's sort of headed at the end for all of us, that should breed in us a kind of humanity which is sometimes in danger of getting sucked out of us so long as we're on this sort of one-track, success-driven road.
Let me ask you who you would see as perhaps a modern anti-hero.
Look, a modern anti-hero. The world, George Eliot has a lovely quote. George Eliot, at the end of Middlemarch, he says, the reason why the world is not as bad as it might be is because there are millions of people who rest in unmarked graves and who've helped throughout their lives to help people to be a little bit saner, a little bit healthier, and a little bit happier. But George Eliot says, we don't know who they are. So, in a way, my answer to your question is, the people who really keep the world going, often they're people, we don't know their names, they're mothers who wake up a little bit early to help their children with homework, they're parents who go that extra mile, they are public servants, people in organizations who just do a little bit more than would normally be expected of them, and they help humanity to survive. And so my anti-heroes, the real heroes, are people we don't know about. They're this psychologically healthy minority who have no need for fame, no desperate need for huge amounts of money. They're happy not standing out. They don't want to make a big name for themselves. They're happy with their family relationships, relationships with those around them, and they are keeping the world sane. They are the minority, but they are the vital link.
It's interesting how you talk about people becoming detached from the world around them, that perhaps they're becoming alienated, as you put it sometimes, because they don't really have the kind of connections they used to have. They don't know where their food has come from, you know, perhaps before they grew it, or in smaller communes where they could see it, or they don't know where some of the goods they come from, you know, consume come from, and so on. And I wonder then, is this being detached from our place of, you know, our knowledge of what we have around us? Is it effectively becoming a smaller cog in a bigger machine? Is that how we're being positioned now?
Look, absolutely. You know, the modern human being is a tiny cog in a vast system which most people don't understand. You know, all of us are subject to currents, be they economic or even environmental currents, that we don't fully understand. You know, what made the economic crisis so troubling is no one saw it coming, and still today very few people understand its nuts and bolts, and yet it affects most people on this planet. And that's the modern world. The modern world is a world where we're in a machine whose workings elude most of us, and that's terrifying, because, you know, if you think about the upheavals in the Middle East, what was really driving them was people wanting to be in political control of their lives. People wanting to say, I want to understand how my government works. I want to have a voice and a say in my destiny. That's all very well in the political sphere, but in the economic sphere, most of us still remain really way out of control. We tend to work for very large organizations whose finances we don't really understand. These organizations in turn are buffeted by winds that they don't understand. And it's no wonder that when you talk to people and you say to people, what's your fantasy of an ideal job? Very many people, and I've talked to a lot of people about fantasies of the workplace, many people will say, you know, I'd love to have a small shop, or a little farm, or a little hotel, or some little enterprise. We're all obsessed with things being slow and personal, peer-to-peer, direct contact, precisely because in our day-to-day lives we know the opposite. We know gigantic cities where people don't know each other anymore. We know huge organizations where people don't quite understand the fibers of what's happening. And all of this is deeply troubling to us. So yes, we end up, as it were, alienated from our own work and from our colleagues and those around us.
Let's squeeze in a call from Oregon. We've got John on the line. John, go ahead, please.
Hi. You were talking about how the American, and I know you weren't talking just Americans, but low self-esteem is a derivative of some, you know, wanting to obtain some kind of social perfection. And I think we got to be clear on what's the social perfection. I think let's just start by not having violence towards each other as that's just the basis of the perfection, and then evolve from there. See, what happens is we like to sit here and point out the differences,
well,
sit here and
John, because we've got about a minute left, let me put it this way to Alan. To what degree is that what we're seeing in terms of crime and so on, how much is that linked to frustration with not being able to reach that level of perfection or reaching those standards that we seem to have set ourselves?
I think it's hugely linked. I think a society that tells everybody, you can do it, you too can become Bill Gates, is going to have a real problem on its hands, because not everyone is going to get there. And what happens to that expectation? It turns into envy and disappointment. It's probably as unlikely now that an average, you know, American or European could reach the pinnacle of a society as it was, you know, 200 years ago. The problem is that we're permanently told that you too can make it. And it's a beautiful idea, don't get me wrong, but it also creates a terrible pressure and a terrible feeling of envy and inadequacy. And that's something we haven't yet learned to reconcile, that inner anxiety that's bred by the sense of permanent possibility.
30 seconds to go. Are we losing our humanity as a result?
I think what we're doing is probably losing our peace of mind. There's an obsession now with calm, an interest in monasteries, an interest in retreats. What's harder than ever is to find stillness because of these very deep pressures to become someone, to achieve greater and greater things.
Right. Alain de Botton, great to have you give some of these thoughts to us, share these thoughts with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Great to be on.
Thank you too for joining us, and remember, you can follow the show on Facebook and see what we're up to today. You can give us your feedback on the topics, and you can post your questions and comments. On the next show, BP's oil spill 1 year on. The cleanup continues as local people struggle with mystery illnesses, a fragile environment, and uncertain economic future. Make sure you tune in for that. From me and the team, we'll see you next time.